Well, in the Gettysburg videos, I made mention of the Gettysburg letter book, and I suggested that in a courtroom the letter book would have a tough time coming into evidence. There would certainly be a debate that would go on outside the presence of the jury over the admissibility of the document. Its only value as a piece of evidence to prove up any of the issues that are relevant to the Gettysburg campaign is the document I mentioned that's found at page 27 of the book in the handwriting of Charles Venable, which purports to be the legitimate substance of General Lee's communication to Richard Ewell, telling Ewell what he expected Ewell to do with his corps in moving it toward Gettysburg. As a preliminary remark, this is a good example of historians, their general failure, including the Civil War writers who have spent their life and have made a living writing about the Battle of Gettysburg, to begin at the beginning. Historians and Civil War writers have the habit of simply, layering on their writing on the writing of other historians and Civil War writers, so that to give themselves credibility, they pretend like they're writing nonfiction. And they do that by having a long list of footnotes at the end of every chapter. But if you go to the footnotes and look through them carefully, you'll see they're just citing themselves. It's a rare instance to find that a writer of these last generations in this area have gone to the source material, the original source material. Now, lawyers don't have the luxury of quoting other lawyers in court. Certainly not in front of a judge when you're trying to get documents and other things into evidence. That would be a wonderful world if we were true. But historians do that all the time. It's hard work. It's hard work. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of time, especially when the primary documents, the original source materials, are scattered all over the United States in various depositories, primarily in North Carolina, in Chapel Hill, in Virginia, at Richmond, Washington, D.C., the National Archives. You have to work your way through these depositories. You have to deal with the administrative issues that are involved. There's a lot of roadblocks. But lawyers would do the work, because no trial lawyer worth his salt that actually knows what he's doing is going to walk into a courtroom without being absolutely sure that the foundation of his case, the theory of his case, rests upon rock solid foundation. And that means you got the source materials in your hand. Now, this is to show you the way in which you can be tricked. Just go to the Rebellion record. I got an old beat up copy of volume 20, the correspondence. And if you go to page 943, Confederate correspondence. This is chapter 29. I think it's volume 27, and it's part 3. what the script is of Venable's writing down of what we're supposed to believe General Lee communicated to Ewell. This is how it reads. General Ewell, Chambersburg, June 28, 1863, 7:30 a.m. I wrote you last night. Now, does he mean, what does he mean last night? Does he mean 1 a.m. on June 28th? Or does he mean 11 p.m. on June 27th? We don't know. We'll have to, his sentence goes on. I wrote you last night stating that General Hooker was reported to have crossed the Potomac. So to understand what he meant by last night, we're going to have to understand when General Lee got this report that Hooker had crossed the Potomac. It's understood generally, there doesn't seem to be any dispute about it, that a scout did arrive at General Lee's camp outside Chambersburg. We call him Harrison because that's the name that Longstreet in his writings gave this fellow. Longstreet has a story about it, not necessarily an accurate statement. Well, you got to dig deep, and that would take probably a day in a courtroom, cross-examining witnesses to get down to the clear understanding of just who this scout was and who was he involved with and how did he get to Chambersburg and what information did he bring in. When did he arrive? Did he arrive the evening of the 27th? Or did he arrive the evening of the 28th? The record is confusing about that, and it's an important factual issue that any lawyer would have to try to get resolved in a courtroom if we're trying to reach our verdict about what General Lee was actually doing. I wrote you last night stating that Hooker was reported to have crossed the Potomac and is advancing by way of Middleton, the head of his column being at Frederick. I directed you in that letter to move your forces to this point. Now, we don't have that letter. And frankly, lawyers being cynical, they have to be, because it's in the nature of human beings as witnesses to lie. It's a plain fact of trial practice. You have to begin with the proposition that every witness that's telling you their little bit of the picture is not being absolutely accurate with you, either because their memory fails them, they're not very bright, or because for reasons of personal interest, self-interest, they're dissembling. They're not giving you the whole story. They're leaving out essential bits of information. They're embellishing for the same reason, adding in information that isn't reality. These are practical problems that trial lawyers deal with every day, and whenever a lawyer reads that kind of a line in a letter, I directed you in that letter, a letter that we don't have, it suggests that we're manufacturing the illusion of a previous communication for our benefit. I directed you in that letter to move your forces to this point. If you have not already progressed on the road, and if you have no good reason against it, I desire you to move in the direction of Gettysburg via Heidlersburg, where you will have turnpike most of the way. And you can thus join your other divisions to Early's, which is east of the mountain. Now there's a lot in that sentence worth dissecting. Ewell's got discretion on 2 points. If you have not already progressed on the road, and if you have no good reason against it, I desire you to move in the direction of Gettysburg via Heilsberg. More importantly, there's a serious problem with that sentence in terms of the facts. According to Ewell, which is corroborated to some extent by Jubal Early, Ewell got a message that came, the evidence seems fairly clear to show, came from a guy named Trumbull, a brigadier general, Trimble, T-R-I-M-B-L-E, who had no command. He had been injured, he had recovered, he had come up in the rear of the army and reached General Lee's headquarters. He's an old friend of General Lee, he's an old timer, and General Lee sends him to Carlisle, to Ewell's headquarters. And he remains with Ewell's headquarters through Ewell's march from that place down to Gettysburg. And it's probably the case that whatever communication came to Ewell from General Lee about this issue of movement came to him through Trimble. Now, Trimble himself survived the war, and he wrote about his experience at this time in the Southern historical papers, but he doesn't disclose whether he himself was the messenger. According to Ewell, that seems to be backed up by Jubal Early, the message he got was to move east of the mountains with the understanding that A.P. Hill's corps, which was marching east through the Cashtown Gap from Chambersburg, would be at Cashtown. And that once he got into that area of Heilsberg, he would be moving either toward Cashtown or toward Gettysburg. It was an either-or situation. And one can infer that if in fact this is the message that General Lee communicated to Ewell, one can infer that it was that alternative that caused Ewell to order Edward Johnson to move his division down the road between Carlisle and Chambersburg, past Shippensburg, to Green Village, and then cross to the southeast to Fayetteville and cut into the Cashtown Gap. Because it was possible, 50-50, that at the end of the day, Ewell would be at Cashtown, not at Gettysburg. There really doesn't seem to be any other logic to it than that idea, the confusion, the uncertainty of just where the concentration point was going to be. Was it going to be at Cashtown, at the eastern mouth of the gap, or was it going to be at Gettysburg? And we have the issue of the weather. We have the issue of Ewell not being timid with the idea of letting Johnson go across that South Mountain. These are the issues. The last sentence, however, makes it very difficult for Ewell not to take Johnson with him. Quote, I think it preferable to keep on the east side of the mountains. So, if this message is in fact accurate and you're reading it, although you've got the discretion, you've got a pretty clear idea what General Lee really wants you to do. When you come to Heilersburg, you can either move directly on Gettysburg or turn down to Cashtown. Now that's consistent with what Ewell and Early say in their reports and later in their writings. Your trains and heavy artillery you can send if you think proper. I don't like this at all, this part. On the road to Chambersburg. But if the roads which your troops take are good, they had better follow you. Your trains and heavy artillery you can send if you think proper on the road to Chambersburg. I just have a real tough time, given the facts of the case, to believe that that is an accurate statement of what General Lee intended. And the only person that we have for that particular line, I mean, the note is now twice referred to the same idea. If you have no good reason against it, I desire you to move in the direction of Gettysburg via Heilersburg and join your other divisions to Early's. I think it preferable to keep on the east side of the mountains. And then to say, I mean, that's clearly telling him what he should be doing. And then to say your trains and heavy artillery you can send if you think proper on the road to Chambersburg, that just does not make much sense. I mean, you know, we're going to have to place the blame, it seems to me, on General Lee for Edward Johnson's failure to be with Rhodes and Early at 3:30 in the afternoon on July 1. Place the blame on General Lee. Because clearly the trains, the Corps trains, all the reserve trains of this Corps, including all those that belong to Early, aren't going to trundle their way down a 25-mile route of road from the south side of Carlisle to Chambersburg without escort. And you could say, well, a brigade would be enough. Johnson's division's got 4 brigades, so a brigade would be enough. Well, a brigade would not be enough. You can just think about what happened at Antietam on September the 15th, when the 1,200 Union cavalry that were at Harper's Ferry crossed the Potomac on the pontoon bridge, went up the left bank of the Potomac to went through Sharpsburg and cut into the road between Williamsport and Hagerstown and cut into Longstreet's trains that were moving at that time in preparation for the battle at Antietam, were moving from Hagerstown south toward Williamsport to cross the Potomac and to come around to Shepherdstown. Cut into that and cut away about 100 wagons and made their escape. So leaving your trains without adequate protection under the circumstances is going to cause you some serious loss. So it would take more than a brigade. Now, would it take a whole division to guard those trains, to accompany those trains? Well, apparently Ewell thought so, because the whole division of Johnson's went south. The second problem with that idea that's recorded here, you gotta think General Lee's a pretty dumb guy. Seems to me, if you've been there, because you can send if you think proper. You think proper? Well, you're telling me that General Lee thought it would be proper on the road to Chambersburg? Because what's going to happen to those trains? Now you could say, well, they would just all be parked at Chambersburg. They wouldn't get in the way. Only Johnson's troops would cut in to the Cashtown Gap and get mingled there with Longstreet's march. The trains would be left at Chambersburg. They'd come along, if at all, in the rear of the infantry movement. You would think that it would have to be it, because otherwise you're going to have one hell of a traffic jam in that gap when that train's cut in there. And in fact, according to this fellow named Hoke, who was from Chambersburg and who wrote a book called The Great Invasion, you know, all through the night of the 29th, the 30th, June the 30th, Ewell's trains were passing through the center square of Chambersburg and then trundling out onto the road going toward Cashtown and through the gap. So you might have stopped all those trains. You just stopped them there at Chambersburg. But you certainly weren't going to bring them through that gap if you could help it. And the problem was, at some point they had to be guarded. And if you were going to use Pickett's division that was stationed at the western mouth of the Cashtown Gap to be responsible for all those trains, then obviously Pickett wasn't coming to the battlefield very quickly. But that did not happen. Those trains went through Chambersburg and they went out into that gap, and they caused a lot of confusion. The most important aspect of this is that Johnson was in that gap also. So then this message ends with this line, this sentence: "But if the roads which your troops take are good, they had better follow you." So Ewell, according to this message, has got the authority to send his trains and heavy artillery to Chambersburg, but if the roads which your troops take are good, they had better follow you. And in this message earlier, he supposedly talks about these roads being good. He says, "I desire you to move in the direction of Gettysburg via Heidlersburg, where you will have turnpike most of the way." So, and in fact, he does have turnpike most of the way from Carlisle to Heidlersburg. So the roads are good. Now, it was raining June 25, June 26, all the way through June 30th, intermittently. Thunderstorms or squalls are going up and down through the Cumberland Valley, and certainly there was a lot of weather to the northwest in the Appalachian Mountains that were causing all the rivers and streams to swell up, throwing great volumes of water into the Susquehanna. But in the Cumberland Valley and down around the South Mountain, these are squalls intermittently, and there's no diaries of witnesses who were on the march who talk about having to slog through mud. The roads were wet, but that would not be a necessarily bad thing on these hot, sweltering days when it wasn't raining. So it's a tough message to deal with. Now, there's a footnote. There's an asterisk here at the end of this thing, and at the bottom it says, "Noted in letter book is copied from memory." And that's where we get to Charles Venable. Now, when did he copy this? Why did Charles Venable? Charles Venable, before the war, was a professor of mathematics at the University of North Carolina and at other universities. After the war, he became chairman of the Department of Mathematics at the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. He lived a long time. He made no speeches, unlike all his associates on General Lee's staff. He made no speeches where he revealed his own personal knowledge of events as staff officer. He wrote nothing, unlike Walter Taylor, who was a prolific writer, Charles Marshall, who was a prolific speaker, A.L. Long, who wrote a biography of General Lee. Unlike those three fellows, he's an enigma. And so why did this highly educated individual, and incidentally, when you go back to the issue of Special Order 191, the Lost Order, he's involved in that. The only reason that these historians today keep parroting the idea that a courier must have lost the copy of the order designated for D.H. Hill that came from General Lee's headquarters is because Walter Taylor in his books and Charles Marshall in A.L. Long in his biography of General Lee, both of them point the finger at Charles Venable as being the guy who knows. Charles Venable always said. Both those writers use that specific language. But Charles Venable apparently was never asked by anyone on the record. Where do you get the idea that a courier lost this order on his way to D.H. Hill's camp? Where do you get that? No one ever asked him, and he never volunteered it. So he's at the center. His name is connected to these two important moments in time, and that's suspicious from a trial lawyer's point of view. We would want to cross-examine Charles Venable very severely on the witness stand about these two issues. And the most important thing is, well, what do you mean for memory? And what do you mean sketch? Just how much a sketch is it? And in terms of memory, when did you write this? Now, the historians will want to tell you, well, he must have written it just, hours or days, just a couple of days later. Well, you won't find any other document in any letter book, in any other publication written by these staff officers that starts out with this business about from memory a sketch. This is unique. And so Venable wrote that in there for a reason. Protect himself. It's a very strange situation. Now the letter book itself, it's a bound letter book. It's about the size of a lawyer's tablet. These pages that I'm holding up here, I personally have been to this book is held by the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond, Virginia. I'll be honest and tell you that I'm not a fan of the Virginia Historical Society. I'm not comfortable with the way they handle certain matters, and this book's one of them. Now, the Virginia Historical Society used to be known as the Southern Historical Society. It was a private organization as it is today. It was started by these staff officers of General Lee's and a couple of their cronies. And I think it was about 1920, the bound book from which these pages have been copied was delivered into the custody of then the Southern Historical Society and today the Virginia Historical Society. It was delivered by these staff officers. How did these staff officers and why did they have possession of this particular original book? Why was not this book, for example, part of General Lee's headquarters records. How come they walked away with it? Well, the night before the surrender, there was a fire in General Lee's headquarters wagons. And the story goes that most of his records were destroyed by accident. Now, we've seen images in movies of, the barbarians are at the gate and, you're in there in your headquarters and you're frantically burning everything in sight. Yeah, there are secrets. There are activities that General Lee probably didn't want anybody to get the primary documents about. So this physical book was surfaced in the possession of these officers sometime after the war, and there's a history about it that I can provide you. It's a waste of your time. It ended up in a bank vault. It passed from hand to hand. Custis Lee seems to have been the custodian of this book for a time, and then it passed to a guy named McCabe, and eventually it reached the Southern Historical Society. You go through this book page by page, and a lawyer would be struck by the content of the book, the subject matter of the various documents, the dates, the handwriting, who wrote which page, and so forth. Some of it is meaningful, some of it is superfluous, and there's different ideas that are wrapped up in the same book that make very little sense in terms of record keeping. There's things out of order also in this book. It gives the impression, we're not in front of a jury, this is lawyers preparing their case. It gives the impression that these officers came together at some point and they chose to write down various letters, communications to different people about different things, merely to create a record for this particular document, which was left the responsibility of Charles Venable to write, and even he hedged by saying he didn't know, maybe something would surface that would directly contradict what he's written here. Who is he protecting in writing this the way he wrote it? It's a heavy question. So from the point of view of our analysis of how the Battle of Gettysburg came to happen and who's responsible for Edward Johnson not being where he should be, this is a damning piece of evidence that impeaches General Lee. Whether Venable intended it or not, if I'm representing Richard Ewell, this is going to be my primary piece of evidence. I'm going to use this to defend General Ewell in front of a jury. If the issue is, are we going to blame Ewell? I'm going to use this document to the full extent possible to persuade the jury the burden, the responsibility has to lie with General Lee. And that may be the reason that Venable wrote this, was to give Ewell some defense to the heavy criticisms. Ewell, for his part, immediately abandoned Richmond, went to Tennessee, got married, and you never heard. He lived on a farm. He never wrote anything. He never got involved in post-war activities at all. He just kept as low a profile as possible because he was taking serious criticism, until the criticism shifted from him in large measure by the activities of these same staff officers to James Longstreet. And so this is really a lifeline, it seems to me, to Richard Ewell that was thrown at him to deflect the criticism that was coming down upon him for his failure to have Edward Johnson where it was supposed to be, and for having this huge traffic jam occur inside the Cashtown Gap. I'll have to admit that the record is far from clear whether or not the trains themselves were actually in that gap congesting the infantry's route of march. I'm not at all comfortable expressing the idea that there's evidence that shows that Ewell's trains actually moved east from Chambersburg at the same time that Longstreet's infantry is marching. Certainly Johnson's infantry, his brigades, came into that gap and became congested with Longstreet's infantry. And Longstreet's infantry had to stop their march and sit by the side of the road while Johnson pressed forward to get to the head of the line. The other interesting thing about this book that I think is helpful in evidence, if the writings don't come into evidence, the fact of their order, the writings might come into evidence, and that's the fact that there's no community. If this is supposed to be the letter book, in which we staff officers are recording all the communications of relevance that are passing between General Lee and his corps commanders in these critical days before the battle begins on July 1, then why is it that we don't have any other communications in this book except this one? Between the day that General Lee crossed the Potomac on June 25 and the day the battle began on July 1. On July 1, we have in this letter book a message supposedly written for communication by General Lee to his cavalry officer, John Imboden, who had been roaming the Cumberland Valley and who was now close to Chambersburg, and whose responsibility, along with Robertson's cavalry brigades, would be to relieve Pickett's division so it could march to Gettysburg. That message telling Imboden to take Pickett's place is in this book, dated July the 1st. The only other message we have between the 25th, when a message is in here recording the communication from Lee to Ewell, is this one, dated June 28th. So, where is the communication that General Lee on the 25th clearly sent to Richard Ewell, who then was at Chambersburg, and which caused Ewell to have a meeting, a conference, with his two division commanders, his three division commanders, Rhodes, Johnson, and Early. And it's that communication from Lee to Ewell that caused Ewell to order Early to go to York. A critical communication, given the situation about. Why is it not in this book? How come that got left out? So this book is a lot of issues, and we took the time, and part of the problem about dealing with primary sources of material is that they're in this kind of condition, their handwriting. Some of it is very difficult to read, but people have taken the time to transcribe this into print. So if you've read the original material, to compare it to what's in print to be sure it's an accurate translation, nothing's been left out, no words have been changed. Then you still have the issue of understanding the construction of the book.